So John, this is a really interesting guitar. I understand there's a story behind it. Maybe you can tell us what we're looking at and why it's here on your bench.
Absolutely. This guitar's got a great history. It's a Taylor 914, and this belongs to Nathan Chapman, Taylor Swift's producer.
Right.
He's also worked with a lot of other artists as well. This was his very first high-end guitar.
Wow.
And he brought this to me back in the 90s after he got it. Had me do some setup work on it. But this has been his workhorse guitar. You know, he's done Taylor Swift's albums. You know, he's also worked with Lionel Richie, Shania Twain, the band Perry. You know, as well as, you know, like Sarah Evans and quite a few other artists. But it's a great guitar, but it's at that point where it just needs some love.
Oh. And you're going to give it some love?
Absolutely.
All right.
We're going to go through this, clean it up, do some work on the saddle, and try to get it to play more in tune.
Okay.
You know, and just the basic maintenance that any guitar is going to need after being played that much.
Right. Cool. All right, so what's the first step here?
Well, the first thing I do before I make any adjustments on a guitar is I tune it up to pitch, and then I'm going to go through and take measurements at the three most critical areas. The height of the string at the 12th fret, the amount of relief or bow in the neck, and the string height at the nut, based on the first fret. So, first thing we do is get this thing up and tuned.
All right, so what happens now?
Well, now that I've got the guitar tuned to pitch, I want to take the measurements. And first thing I do is take a capo and I place it on top of the first fret. Not before, not after, but right on top of that first fret. The purpose of that is to take the string height of the nut out of the equation, because we don't know if these string slots are too high, too low. We have no idea.
Right.
So at this point, we want to take that out of the equation. From there, we're going to measure the action at the 12th fret. We're also going to check and see how much bow or relief is in the neck. And that'll determine, you know, what adjustments need to be made there. And then all these factors will also affect the string nut once we get to that point.
Okay.
So first, I'm going to take my action gauge and I'm going to measure the action, the height of the strings between the bottom of the string and the top of the fret. And I'm going to do that for each one to get a really good visual and idea of how high the action is or how low it is. In this case, the action is ridiculously high, which I can understand why this guitar is so difficult to play.
For example?
Well, for example, the high E string is almost 7/64 of an inch from the top of the fret.
Wow.
That's extraordinarily high. Typically, you'd want that around 4/64 of an inch. You know, and as we come up the neck, I mean, even the G is just over 7, and so on and so forth. And we've got about 6/64 of an inch height on the low E string. So overall, that's really high, especially on the treble side of the guitar. The next thing I do is, of course, write that down. It's important to keep records of what you're doing, and so you know where the guitar is, then you know where you can take the guitar to. You know, what adjustments you can make to make it play better. The next thing I'm going to do is measure the amount of relief or bow in the neck. Typically, I hold the low E string down at the last fret. We still have the capo on at the first fret. And using this gauge, I'm going to check and see what the greatest distance between the top of the fret and the bottom of the low E string is. That greatest distance is a clear indication of how much bow is in the neck. Or in extreme cases, I've had guitars that actually had a back bow in the neck where there was just absolutely no relief at all. This one looks really good. We're at about 12 thousandths relief. That's perfect.
Okay.
So I'm going to record that measurement. And the final step of the measurements is you remove that capo from the first fret And I'm going to measure the action at the first fret from the bottom of the string again to the top of that fret for each string. And this looks nearly perfect. In fact, I would definitely have to call this perfect. The action at the nut is exactly where it needs to be. It's about 1/64th of an inch, or 15 thousandths, at the first string. And as you come up to the sixth string, it actually graduates up to 2/64ths, or about 30 thousandths of an inch. That's perfect.
That's great.
And of course, the wound strings need to be a little bit taller, because of course, when you strike those, they tend to vibrate in a wider pattern.
Right.
So they tend to rattle more.
Right.
So you want a little more height there. Okay, now that I've got all the measurements done, I want to check the intonation on this.
Okay. And what are you doing that? How are you checking the intonation?
I'm checking the intonation by playing the 12th fret harmonic, making sure that's in tune, because that's your constant. And then comparing that to the fretted note at the 12th fret to see if they match. So there's the harmonic. There's the fretted note, which isn't too bad on the low E. We'll check the G. That's really sharp.
There are a lot of factors involved for getting the guitar to play in tune.
Oh yes, quite a bit. It all comes down to the distance between the string nut and the 12th fret, and the 12th fret and the saddle, where the final point of contact occurs for each string. And each string is going to end up in a different location in order to harmonically balance the guitar, so that as you're playing chords up and down the neck, it plays well in tune. There are also other factors that will greatly affect the intonation, especially at the string nut. If the strings are too high from the first fret at the nut, as you're pressing down those strings, it'll actually give you a sharper note. So it'll play more and more out of tune. Even though at the 12th fret, you know, the intonation may be dead on. If the action isn't correct, and if the, whether it be at the nut, the amount of relief in the neck, or the saddle, the intonation will be very, very compromised. Okay, now that we've taken all of our measurements as far as the action is concerned, and we've checked the intonation to see how sharp or flat each string is, the next thing we need to do is remove the strings and measure the actual radius of the fingerboard, because we have to make sure that the saddle that we carve matches the radius of the fingerboard, so that you don't end up with some strings too high or too low, or just out of balance. So first step, start pulling the strings off. Now, a cool little trick that I learned about pulling strings out of the bridge, sometimes the pins get stuck a little bit. If you push the string in, the pin typically will pull right out, nice and easy. That way you don't have to try to pry it out of the bridge, because that can be really frustrating. But as you can see, if you just push it in a little bit, they pop right out. So now we have the strings out of the way. I'm going to use this gauge to tell me what the radius of the fingerboard really is. And because when you carve a saddle, most of the measurements we're going to do are going to be at the 12th fret, that's the area we want to check the radius for. Some guitars do have what they call a compound radius, where it's a little bit rounder down at the first frets and then gradually flattens out as you get to the end of the fingerboard. So our main concern is going to be around the 12th fret to make sure that we've got that radius exactly correct. So I go through and check this. This particular guitar looks like it's definitely about a 14-inch radius on the fingerboard.
So what's involved with carving the saddle, and what tools do you need?
Well, there are a bunch of different things that I use for that. First step is to take this saddle and match it up with another bone blank. From there, what we're going to do is carve the top of the saddle to match the proper radius, corner the ends of it so they're rounded and it fits end to end in the bridge. And then, of course, the thickness also is very important. Make sure it's not too tight or too loose.
Okay.
Thus preventing any other issues. So from here, these are the tools that are going to be necessary in order to accomplish that. First, we have a radius block here, which is basically a block of wood with some sandpaper on it that matches the radius of the fingerboard on the tailor. From there, I'm going to use these various blocks with various grits of sandpaper on them to sand the thickness, the edges, and the height of the saddle.
Okay.
From there, I've got these specialized files for carving the angle of the string and the point of intonation for each string.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm going to compare the old saddle, which was much too tall and uncompensated, with the new saddle, blank that we're getting ready to carve to replace it with. And as you can see here, the new blank is a little bit shorter than what the original saddle was, but that's okay because the action was far too high before with the old saddle. So as we're carving this new saddle, I'll be able to get the action down lower, and the first thing I need to do is make sure the radius, this profile on top of the saddle, matches the fingerboard. So to do that, I'm going to take a pencil and just kind of mark the top of it a little bit. So once I've done that, you can see how I've got it marked. I'm going to place it on this radius block and gently sand it. Just a few passes. And just look for any spots where I can still see the graphite from the pencil. And then once all those pencil marks are gone, I know that the radius of this is going to match the fingerboard, which is our first objective. The next thing we need to do is make sure the thickness of this is correct. Make sure it's not too thick or too thin. That way the saddle won't be too tight when you're pressing it into the bridge slot, the saddle slot. And likewise, if it's too loose in the saddle slot, that can actually cause the bridge to crack or break the saddle. So to get the thickness correct, I'm going to come over here to these blocks that I have here. I've got one with 220 grit sandpaper, another one with 400 grit sandpaper. You start with the 220. It's a little more aggressive. Next, I'm going to hit it on the 400 grit paper. It's much finer. It'll actually polish the saddle just a little bit. Next, I want to try to place this back in the bridge saddle slot and make sure it fits. And then from there, I'll know whether or not I need to keep sanding or if we're good to go. And in looking at this, the saddle is still a little bit on the thick side. It's just not going to fit in that slot just yet. So I need to sand it just a little bit more. It's getting closer. Pretty snug. That might be a little too snug. I don't know if you can see this. See how there's a dark mark there? That's a real tight spot from where the wood was putting a lot of pressure up against that saddle, meaning that the saddle's still just a little bit thick, especially in this area. See how we have a nice snug fit, but the saddle won't wiggle. That's exactly what you want. Now what I need to do is round off the edges of the saddle so that it matches the rounded edges of the slot. That way it fits in there nice and smooth. To do that, we're going to come back over to here using 80 grit paper, and at a bit of a steep angle, I'm just going to roll it away from me to create that rounded edge. Okay, so now we're going to follow that same procedure but on the 400 grit paper. This will kind of polish the edges a little bit, make it nice and smooth. Just do a couple of passes. Just to kind of round it up a little bit. You want to make each side look as uniform as possible. Okay, so here we can see that the saddle is still just a little bit too long to fit perfectly in the end of that slot. So I'm going to take a little more material off of here and then round it again. Okay, now that we've sanded the edges, the thickness, the radius, all that, we can check and make sure it fits. It's nice, smooth, goes in nice and easy. No wiggle to it. Fills in the entire slot, but it's not so tight that you can't pull it out with your fingers. Okay, now that the saddle fits perfectly in the saddle slot, what I'm going to do is mark the height of the saddle and take off a little bit of material off the bottom of the saddle. As you can see, I'm marking this at a little bit of an angle because one side of the saddle is taller than what it needs to be. So I just want to take a little bit off the base side, but a lot off the treble, since the saddle is based off of the old saddle, which the treble side was way too high. Okay, so now we're going to remove a little bit of material off of the bottom of the saddle. I've already marked it, so we're just going to push the saddle along the sandpaper. Make sure you keep the saddle as square as possible. Don't lean this way or that way. And you always want to go in one direction. We need to just round off these edges here. That way you don't have a sharp edge on your saddle.
Is that the back side of the saddle that you're rounding off? In other words, where the bridge pins are?
It's just the corners, the ends of them. So right here and right here.
Oh.
See how it's kind of squared there?
Sharp against your hand.
When you're strumming, you can end up injuring yourself. So I'm going to round those off just a little bit. So I'm using the 220 grit paper. And just want to round that edge off a little bit, just so it's not quite so sharp. And then I'm going to move over to the 400 grit paper. Just a light polish there. There we go. Now they're nice and smooth on both sides. Okay, now I'm going to mark a couple of areas off where I need to carve angles in the points of contact for the saddle. So the B string typically is going to be carved back to where it has the furthest point of contact on the back side of the saddle. Likewise, the low E is the same way. So I'm going to mark an area there and graduate that up towards the G. So in essence, the low E is going to be the furthest point back. The A will advance a little bit more, the D a little bit more, and the G all the way forward. The B will be carved back to the furthest point of contact. Generally, the high E is somewhere halfway in between. So these are just kind of rough points of contact or points of reference. So I know exactly how much material to take off for now. Once I've carved this, then I'll string it up with some new strings and just see where the intonation falls. And leave just enough room so that I can move the point of contact back or forward according to what's necessary. So now I'm going to carve the angles on the saddle. And these are the angles that are going to be facing the neck. Okay, so these are not the angle that the string is going to follow, but more carving back the saddle to roughly where we think the points of intonation should be. So I'm removing a little more material right here where the B string is going to be to move that point of contact back a little bit further than the rest of them. Okay, now for the low E string, we know that that's going to be one of the furthest points back on the saddle. So I'm carving the front of that saddle to give some clearance for that string. And this is the side of the saddle that's going to be facing the neck. And then I'm just going to kind of feather it back a little bit here for the A and D string. And just kind of smooth all that out. So now you can see we just have a thin point of contact up here, but it widens out as we get closer to the G string. Okay, now that we've got the basic angles carved on the neck side of the saddle, what we're going to do is carve the angles on the back side of the saddle, keeping in mind each string is going to have its own angle and point of contact on the saddle, and they're all going to differ. So it's important to carve each angle correctly for each string. And then next, I'm going to start carving the saddle at that angle. You can see where that tape tapers into the bridge right there. You can see a little indentation of where the string is going to come out of that bridge pinhole. So I'm going to start carving at that specific angle. And I'm just barely going to sand or file where the B string is, because that you need a pretty sharp point of contact there, just not too sharp. I'm going to come over to the G.
Wow, I can really see you've moved the B string back all the way to the edge there, and then you've got this point back toward the end of this saddle.
Yeah, and essentially this is just kind of roughed in for now. This kind of gives me the rough idea of where each intonation point should be. And then what I'm going to do next is put the old strings back on, tune it up to pitch, and measure the action and see if I got it right. And then from there I can decide whether or not I need to lower it a little bit more.
And then would you do any fine-tuning of the intonation after that?
Yeah. Once I have the action exactly where I want it, then what I'll do is I'll put some new strings on it, get those stretched out, settled in, and then check those intonation points again. And from there I can adjust it, either direction.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so now I've put the old strings back on the guitar, tuned it up to pitch, put the capo on top of the first fret. Now I'm going to measure the action at the 12th fret, just to see if it's too high or too low, so I can get a good idea of where we stand. And in looking at this, it looks like the action's still a little bit on the high side. We're at about 5/64 by 6/64. 5/64 on the treble side, 6 on the bass. That's still just a little bit too high. So I need to shave off about 1/64 of an inch, which doesn't sound like a lot, but on a guitar, that's a mile.
So where are we at?
Where we're at now is I removed the strings another time, took a little more material off the bottom of that saddle just to get the action right. So put the strings back on, tuned it up to pitch, got the capo on that first fret, going through and measuring at the 12th fret, and man, we're right there. We're right exactly where the action needs to be in order for this to play the best it can.
All right. And what would that be up on the...
It's 4/64 on the high E string, and it graduates up to 5/64 on the bass side. And it's better to take it slow and have to, unstring it and take a little more material off at a time, rather than go too far and then find out you went too far.
Okay, so what happens now?
Well, at this point, we're ready to take these strings off, clean up the fingerboard, polish up the frets, condition everything, tighten up the hardware, restring it with the new strings, and then from there, get those stretched and settled in, and then check the intonation, see where we're at.
Okay.
I'm going to apply a little bit of hydrate to the footboard and bridge.
Wow.
And look at how that changes the color, darkens it up, makes it look brand new.
So, what have we got now?
Well, now we've got the new strings on it, got it all cleaned up, conditioned, tuned to pitch, and went through, double checked the intonation, and it's extremely close. There's a couple of strings I might have to do a little bit of fine tuning on, but overall this thing is good to go.
And that fine-tuning would simply entail taking the strings off, repeating the process that you showed us before with the files.
Exactly.
Sending it back in and stringing it up.
Yep. Yep. Just got to move a few of these contact points back. Clean it, polish it up, and it's good to go.
All right. Wow. Nice job.
Thanks.